Hello, world. Welcome to part three of the Brothers Blue doing our criticism of Christian Watson's video. The environmentalist cult must be stopped, something or other. Just to get us started, that's Brother Kyle.
And that is Brother Cody. And we are going to just kind of get right into it once again. I'm going to pick up where we left off in the timestamp or whatever for Christian's video at the timestamp of 13:19. We'll just get started here and continue our reaction.
Basically said that through innovation, man can use the environment for his own purposes, and therefore, according to Lynn White, this coupled with the Christian view of the environment, which in his opinion views us as distinct from it, with dominion over it, essentially created the conditions that have led to all of these economic catastrophes, the ecological crisis, as the title of his book says. I will quote directly from it. He says that I personally doubt that disastrous ecologic backlash can be avoided simply by applying to our problems more science and more technology. Our science and technology have grown out of Christian attitudes toward man's relation to nature, which are almost universally held not only by Christians and neo-Christians, but also by those who fondly regard themselves as post-Christians. Despite Copernicus, all the cosmos rotates around our little globe. Despite Darwin, we are not in our hearts part of the natural process. We are superior to nature, contemptuous of it, and willing to use it for our slightest whim. The newly elected governor of California, like myself a churchman but less troubled than I, spoke for the Christian tradition when he said, as is alleged, when you've seen one redwood tree, you've seen them all. To a Christian, he goes on to say, a tree can no longer be more than a physical fact. The whole concept of a sacred grove is alien to Christianity in the ethos of the West. For nearly 2 millennia, Christian missionaries have been chopping down sacred groves, which are idolatrous because they assume spirit in nature. So Lynn White, the entire basis of his claim is that by not seeing ourselves as a product or integral to nature, but instead seeing ourselves as separate or not necessarily in nature, but taking control over nature, we have perpetuated a idea which puts into effect a lot of bad outcomes for the environment. And he blames this squarely on Christianity because the idea that Christians believe God created the world, and Christians don't necessarily believe that nature itself is sacred. They believe that the transcendent, beyond the natural world, is sacred. Therefore, their lack of emphasis on nature being sacred is precisely what has premeditated a lot of these ecological disasters. This is what he says. Now, there's a few problems with this. Number one, the spirit of civilization is birthed from fire, and fire reflects creativity. Very simply, my friends, Lynn's complaint is that civilization grew out of a desire to conform nature to our desires as opposed to us conforming ourselves to nature's desires, which really doesn't make much sense if you think about it, because nature doesn't have desires. It's a process, an inanimate, impersonal process that we just exist in. It just is. It's not anything particularly special. But his complaint comes out of that desire for us to conform our nature to our desires. But civilization, the impulse, the social impulse in man, quite literally birthed civilization. And this is pre-Christian. Primitive man became civilized man, not because he heard the Sermon on the Mount or became a follower of Jesus Christ, but because he realized that as he grew, as he explored the world more, and as he discovered more, and as he stumbled into things which enhanced his life, he realized there was more to life than simply living in caves and living in subsistence. And in fact, Lynn White actually says that in his ideal society, before industrialization, subsistence farming, that means just living barely above your means, just living at the basic line possible, basically in poverty, is ideal.
Yeah, so this is an idea that he presents that I take massive issue with. Uh, Basically the idea that subsistence farming is essentially living in poverty. So subsistence farming has occasionally in modern societies been linked to poverty. But throughout most of history, subsistence farming has actually resulted in middle class prosperity. And there were even like subsistence farmers here in the United States, in America, uh, that were definitely more prosperous and had a higher standard of living than their factory worker counterparts in the northern states. So like if you were a subsistence farmer in South Carolina, you probably had a better life than a factory worker in Massachusetts during like the colonial period. So he's just wrong here as usual. And I really kind of just despise the idea that subsistence farming is a bad thing.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree with that. And there's actually there's not much for me to say on that, which is fine because that was 4 minutes that we just watched of him. And so all the way back at the beginning, he was talking about kind of like this exploitative nature, and don't forgive me for saying nature, the exploitative nature of the nature or the relationship between nature and man. So like I agree with that premise. I do think that man has gotten to a point where we are no longer caretakers of the environment. We are, or nature, or anything like that. It is more of a relationship of exploitation. Um, I think that's true. That's just kind of all there is to it. Yeah. And then one of the next parts we'll get into actually because he talks about like Marx and stuff. So I want to talk about this next point that I have later. But another thing that he said that just drives me crazy is he says that nature is, it just is. And he's like, it's inanimate. And it's like, dude, nature is inanimate? Since when is nature inanimate? Like that is like the furthest correct descriptor word to describe nature. It's not inanimate. Nature is alive.
Well, and to sort of try to bridge the gap here is I feel like he's almost pointing out at nature's like neutrality towards and towards society. And that is really unfortunate.
Yeah.
Which kind of gets into the deeper philosophies here, which I think are rather absurd. But another thing that Lynn White says, I think it should make all of our eyes go big, is how he emphasizes the mission of the environmentalists. He says, for example, that the greatest spiritual revolutionary in Western history, St. Francis, a Catholic saint, proposed what he thought a Christian alternative view of nature would be in man's relation to it. He tried to substitute the idea of the equality of all creatures, including man, for the idea of man's limitless world creation. He failed. He goes into how the scientific and technological ideas of our age are informed by Christianity. But here's what he says that really caught my eye. Since the roots of our trouble are so largely religious, the remedy must also be essentially religious. Whether we call it that or not, we must rethink and refill our nature and destiny. The profoundly religious but heretical sense of primitive Franciscans for the spiritual autonomy of all parts of nature may point a direction. I propose Francis as a patron saint for ecologists. This is Lynn White in the foundational text of modern environmentalism. Environmentalism is a secular religion. Here's the proof.
Okay, so just to get us started, because I was covering environmentalism today in my class, and this isn't in my notes, but there's a foundational text of American environmentalism. It is Silent Spring, written by Rachel Carson. And so to sort of dismantle Christian's point here is he really does say that like all religions are cults pretty much, and the evidence that he provides is that modern day environmentalism is a religion or cult, is that that guy says that Lynn White says that Francis of Assisi should be the patron saint of environmentalism. So because Lynn White said that, it is clearly a religion. And it's like, dude, going pretty far here.
And so this is where I think this note comes in perfectly for me, because I watched this video and I'm like, this is not about environmentalism.
Yeah.
This is about philosophy and religion. Like, and I think he gets even further into it, and it's just like, come on, man, why are we talking so much about religion and philosophy when your video has environmentalist in the title?
Yeah, that's pretty good.
Now, Lynn White says something that's quite interesting, because we have commentators in our current world that may say, well, Christian, this is all Marxism. Again, I have to caution you against that sentiment. Why?
Why? Because you should caution against that sentiment, because calling this Marxism just points out once again like a complete like lack of understanding of both of these concepts, environmentalism and Marxism.
Because Lynn White, in his own essay, basically says that Marxism is a Judeo-Christian heresy. Why does he say this? He says this because he claims that Marxism grows out of this idea of perpetual material progress, and therefore leaves no room for man to have an equal understanding of the environment, and just leaves room for materialistic constructs. Now, he's not entirely incorrect. Marxism definitely does have a dialectical materialist process where it says that there will be two classes, and one class will eventually overtake the other. He's correct about that, but he's definitely incorrect by saying Marxism is Christian or Judeo. It's not at all. It's actually a rejection. It's a atheistic philosophy which rejects the transcendent, and so therefore it couldn't be. But
yeah, so amidst all the gish gallops, I feel like this is where he really goes off the rails, because he's saying that Marxism can't be described as Christian or Judeo because it's atheistic. And atheism is ultimately the primary form of heresy. The, dismissal of Christian or Judeo doctrine is atheism. And so to say that it can't be described as Christian Judeo is just kind of ridiculous, because it is clearly Christian Judeo heresy.
Right. You have to have something to, it's like there has to be a God to not believe in.
Yeah.
Right.
It doesn't make any sense. It's like, well, if it's heresy, then it has to be antithetical to Christian Judeo. So shouldn't it be described as Christian Judeo?
Right, exactly. Yep.
Yeah.
But this is the sentiment of a large swath of early environmentalists that believe that Marxism was actually bad. And so what we've established here is that the foundational text of modern day environmentalism, which presumes that Christianity is the enemy, which presumes that man's impulse to pursue his potential and grow by conforming the world to his needs, which is a prerequisite for civilization, is a bad thing. All of that in this essay is chalked up to be the cause of our problems. Now, that is the man-nature relationship. I'll talk about other things I talked about very quickly. The town-country distinction. Now, this is where the Marxists come in. The Marxists come in and say, okay, towns are actually derivative of the countryside. The countryside is what actually existed first. And you'll find this a lot with environmentalists. They will literally worship the rural areas. They will worship the countryside. They will praise it and say, this is our idea of society, which is why I say that environmentalism is first and foremost a primitive philosophy. But here's what they say. The Marxists will say the countryside after the Industrial Revolution was exploited by towns that grew out from it and amassed in urban centers and urban environments, so much so that the distinction between country and town became like oppressor and oppressed, kind of like the distinction between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. And so this is actually a very important principle to many environmentalists, which is actually fundamentally Marxist, whether they realize it or not. But they believe this, and they believe that the relationship between the countryside and the town is inherently exploitative. Now, again, why don't I think this is true? Well, very simply, I don't believe that social progress or human growth, which is what the development of towns kind of represents, is a zero-sum game. The fact that you have industrial farms in the countryside making millions of dollars, which are then put into local economies, which employ a lot of people in those areas, which are traditionally poor, countrysides are traditionally poor, is not necessarily a bad thing. It's actually a great thing.
Yeah, so he never like explains why the rural poor, as he points out, is according to him a good thing. And that is unfortunate because he instead just goes on to chastise Marxists.
Dude, I don't think he's ever met a rural poor person. So this is my thing, is he talks about corporate farming in this situation where it's like, I'm pretty sure this guy does not understand how agriculture works in the United States, because this is where this note comes in perfectly for me. And it reminds me of our friends in high school picking strawberries because they were the only people who were available on the weekends. And they worked with, let's just be honest, immigrants who were also easily underpaid and would work any hours of the day. And so that's kind of what happens on these big corporate farms. I don't think Christian really gets what kind of jobs these are. Sure, are the local economies being pumped by these sometimes? Yes, sure, sometimes, absolutely. But at the same time, they're absolutely exploiting nature and exploiting the people through their labor. So
yeah. I agree with you that I think he just has a vast misunderstanding of how agriculture works in modern America.
And I'm sorry, I've met these people. I know these people.
Well, yeah, like we literally were the rural poor. If you grow up in the town of Club Bay, Washington, and had food stamps growing up, literal food stamps, not an EBT card, actual food stamps. Yeah, that is the rural poor.
And it kind of disproves this idea that this entire thing is exploitative. For the Marxist, or for the person that cannot understand the true first principles of a free economy, anything that involves someone else benefiting from your work is exploitative, which is just not true. If you believe that we live in an interactive society that is generated by an even more interactive economy, which repays both the producer and the producee for what they do. But again, the town-country distinction is derivative of a broader Marxist think that we understand is just not true, not correct. But also, if we keep going on, the idea of no growth also feeds into this. So you may hear of this term degrowth, which is actually a movement that is a derivative of the environmentalist creed, which basically says we need to actually scale back the amount of growth we have, cut back on a lot of things, make our cities smaller, make our towns smaller. It's basically a philosophy of austerity and subsistence. And the environmentalists will actually realize that. They will deny the importance of human progress because they worship the environment as a spiritual entity, as Lynn White covered, as a religious force, and therefore degrowth is justified on those grounds. Because again, they're not approaching this from rational, sound argumentation. They're approaching this from a place of religious fervor, a place of spiritual fervor, which in my opinion, even if it is spiritual and is religious, is founded on incorrect metaphysical assumptions. Nature is not sacred, nature just is. But that's a different gripe, different day, and I'll get into that in a second. And so we have to understand that when they say degrowth, they're talking about allowing the world, allowing nature to reclaim itself, and therefore shedding the products of innovation within our world. Now, no growth is a similar idea, but it has a sort of different premise. The premise of no growth is that small communities, small scale communities that exist within the vastness of nature. There's actually a formal word for this called a garden city. A garden city is basically a city that has very little industrial prowess and exists within nature and tries to derive from the land and also take care of it. So that's basically what they want. They want garden cities, and it's really an absurd concept, which again can only really exist if the desire to achieve human potential is so limited that it doesn't want to aspire beyond the mere subsistence. Again, this environmentalism is.
Yeah, so once again, I just can't agree that, with his concept that subsistence is like inherently bad. And this is another one of those things that seems to me, what?
Just makes no sense. Sorry.
Yeah, no, it seems to, yeah, it's to me
like war on subsistence. It's weird.
Yeah, exactly. Like, what's your beef with subsistence? And I'll elaborate on that in a minute, but to make a broader point, it is just another one of those things that the right paints as bad things. These things that I think are sort of almost transparently good.
Sure.
Maybe not subsistence, like that one you might have to argue for a little more. He brought up ESG scores earlier, and like when you research that, it's like, well, why would you think that's bad? Or like Great Reset is a conversation or a topic I've delved into deeply, and once again, the right just paints it as this like big nefarious conspiracy, and it's like, did you read the book? Like, yeah. So they do this thing where they just paint things that are like seemingly good as bad things.
So there was this point that Christian was seemingly refuting, and that is maybe the idea that there is a certain divinity to nature, or that nature is divine. Does this ring any bells to you?
Yeah.
So I will say this. I've thought about this recently. I'm not completely against the idea of nature being divine or having divinity. And not only that, it makes as much sense as any kind of monotheistic or, whatever type of religion you want to say. Nature as a religion makes just as much sense as Jesus Christ as religion.
But he's contradicting himself. He literally said that nature is like nothing, basically.
Exactly. So
he's like a non-action. It's like, which one is it?
Yep, you're right. That's a good point. Very good point.
A philosophy of misanthropy. It is a philosophy of hatred of humanity, because it literally debases man to the level of lower ordered beings, which is why when Lynn White says he wants equality amongst the animals, well, I'm sorry, human beings are not equal to lower order animals. A human being is not equal to an ant. A human being is not equal to a spider. We are higher order animals who have the ability to understand abstraction, which distinguishes us from everyone else, to reason our way through the world, to create civilization, to derive more from the world than it derives from us. Every other animal on this planet can only derive as much from the world as it derives from them, which is essentially very little. It's just instinct. It's just barely surviving. Man is not meant to survive. He's meant to thrive. And
yeah, so I just also at this point can't agree with like his concept of thriving, because in a world where things like rampant poverty exist, subsistence can actually literally be thriving. Like to subside, to be able to subsist in a world of poverty, you're probably thriving compared to those who are actually impoverished.
Yeah, and I would say just overall thriving as a person is highly relative.
Subjective.
Yeah, and relative. Subjective, relative, like I mean, who's to say that I'm not thriving and you're not thriving and he's not thriving, like everyone I think has their own relative levels of success for personal satisfaction. Yeah.
Well,
the environmentalist ethos rejects that. But no growth cities say, yes, have primitive small scale societies, because that will allow the natural world to exist more bountifully and exist more conclusively than previously held. Another idea that is quite powerful amongst environmentalists is the idea that social progress cannot be related to material progress. So they basically believe that a society that is good and ecologically sound is a society that does not at all take into account how much growth you have in terms of money, in terms of buildings, in terms of GDP, in terms of any of that. All that matters is your personal beliefs and values and how they inform you as a person. Now, while I think that values and personal beliefs are very important, and while I reject materialism on every level, I also understand that values are the antecedents, the predicates to man being able to obtain material splendor. Values and the progression of an economy or the progression of human life from a lower state to a higher state are not at odds. They are in fact in tandem if they are understood correctly. A lot of the environmentalist position really can just be talked down to ignorance, primitive religious ignorance. It doesn't actually take into account the full scope of the nature of these concepts. To say that values and material progress are opposed is the same thing as saying that swimming and drowning are one and the same. No, they're not. If you know how to swim, i.e., if you have the right value about swimming, you are most likely not going to drown if you are smart about it. But if you don't have any value about swimming whatsoever, and you just view it as an activity, then you may very well drown. But the values that undergird your desire to swim are directly connected to your survival in the water. The values that undergird your desire to progress as a human being are directly connected to your material splendor. This is why successful people, rich people, tend to have better mindsets, tend to be very hardworking in many cases. In some cases they're not, but they tend to have different mindsets than those who are poor, not because they're better, but because they have the right values. But environmentalism says that the material world, if it is used in any way, in any other way, except from whence it came, or except in a way that actually enhances its processes, that is evil, that is disrespectful, and that is indicative of exploitation. But it's not. It's the exact opposite, as I have explained. So,
yeah. So, in my opinion, his explanation is merely a misguided oversimplification of the environmentalist movement, and he actually ends it by implying that poor people have bad values.
Yeah, so I think he does that even more so, because I think he doubles down on that, the whole "you're poor because you have bad values." But I'll also say this swimming and drowning thing reminds me of the dude at the park with his son earlier, and I'm just like, what the fuck are we talking about?
Yes.
So that's how I feel at those kinds of moments. But yeah, my last note was you're poor because you don't have the right values. And then my very last note actually came, and I told you this, it comes back to me because environmentalist is kind of even more, I think that's kind of an obscure term as well, because I think more of it as being like the issue of climate change. Like, I guess I would call myself an environmentalist because I am a certain, I lean a certain way on those issues around the environment. But again, it all comes down to data for me. And it's like, dude, all of the data is showing us. So like, you can't just really argue with the science. Like, if you want to, then that's not the conversation I'm looking to have. So.
Well, your point is entirely indicative of the fact that like he obviously tries to make everything about philosophy,
Right.
unfortunately, and he also I get the impression that he like considers himself an amateur historian or maybe, which I have beef with. So like his obsession with Lynn White, when it's like, dude, we both consider ourselves in like part of, and that's why he uses the term environmentalism is because it goes back to the 60s and 70s, and he's trying to make a historical argument, and it's like, dude, it's all philosophical. everything you ever say is a philosophical argument.
Dude, and you're not wrong, because this thing also goes by a different name every 10 years. Right now it's called climate change. It was called global warming, and it's been
Well,
called every other thing. So yeah.
the modern iteration is climate change activists. And it's like,
Right. Exactly.
Okay.
So what
You mean
if yeah,
environmentalists?
is that what we are?
Yeah, I guess.
Right, cool. All right, then that sounds good. If you want to finish this off.
All right, guys. As always, remember Francis Bacon said, knowledge is power.